prosecutor, Sarah Turner, apparently did not get that memo, and he went on to put on quite a performance and was admonished by the judge 4 times and just continued on. And he looked over at Ross, who was sitting peacefully. I mean, if you saw Ross, I mean, he's just a very peaceful, tranquil person. He goes, "That man is dangerous. That man is a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. That man's family doesn't know him. He's dangerous." I mean, I'm talking a real performance. And he's playing to the room. It's full of media. Well, they reported it. Suddenly Ross all over the world is dangerous, deprived of bail. And yet, 2.5 months later, that same prosecutor in court in New York at Ross's arraignment did not indict him for one single charge of murder for hire. Now, if it's serious enough to deprive a man of bail, and serious enough to be so dangerous, why didn't they indict him for it? I don't know. They did mention it under another count, narcotics trafficking, at what's called an uncharged crime. Now, I never knew that this thing existed, because I figured if it's crime, you charge. If it's not a crime, you don't charge. But it's an uncharged crime. It conveniently does not require any proof, and it just sits there, not part of the indictment. There is another indictment that was there from the beginning in Maryland. They're not doing much with that right now because it's all being handled in New York. I expect it to go the way of the others personally. So, another obstruction by the prosecution that we have suffered is that at that same arraignment, the judge is very concerned that Ross get access to evidence and be able to take part in his own defense and participate in what's called discovery. And that means they have to submit the evidence to Ross, and they have on 2 CDs. However, that was February. By the time I left for here, 5 months later, he did not have a laptop with software that could read it. No access. He actually did call me while I was here and said, "Well, I finally got a laptop. Now we're not sure if he's going to have time. They're going to allow him time in the prison to read it, and we may have to go back to court for that." You know, this is not a basketball game where you run out the clock and so your opponent can't score. This is a man's life and his liberty. And his trial date is November 3rd, and time's a wasting. And this is what's going on. He should have had that laptop with and be able to read his discovery a long time ago. So after the indictment, what happens is the defense gets to challenge the indictment. And our lawyer submitted 50 pages of pretrial motions that do that. And another lawyer on his blog said, what these motions reveal is the inadequacy of existing law to understand, define, or stay apace with technology. And I think I can show you in this talk that this case is a lot more about Ross than about just Ross and Silk Road. So whether you think Ross is a hero or a villain, or you think Silk Road is a great free market experiment or an evil enterprise, is one thing. How they are using the law in this case is very alarming to me. So this is not about guilt or innocence or anything. It's just the indictment. That comes later. Another thing that comes later is the government's methods and how they found a server, if what they did was legal. Considering all the revelations we've had about the NSA and parallel construction, these may be very reasonable questions, but that comes later, as well as whether or not Ross is guilty or innocent. But what they're doing here, and I'll show you, is that they're taking laws that address the physical world and applying them, forcing them onto the virtual world and activity. So it's like forcing a square peg into a round hole. So here we go. First count, narcotics trafficking. Now, to be guilty of this, you have to have bought, sold, or possessed drugs. They're not alleging that Ross did that. They're alleging that he provided a platform where other people bought and sold drugs. This is called transferred intent. One person's intention and action, one person is guilty for the intentions of action of others. And the indictment relies very heavily on this throughout. I'll show you more later. Well, Josh Draytell says this is unprecedented and extraordinarily expansive. It expands criminal liability. I mean, that's obvious. If you're responsible for yourself and someone else, expands your criminal liability. The next count is the continuing criminal enterprise or the kingpin charge. This has specific definitions as well. You have to have organized, managed, or supervised a specific number of people in a criminal enterprise, usually drugs. They're not saying Ross did that. They're saying he was the owner and operator of Silk Road. Also in this count, they're very vague. They talk about a series of violations and certain narcotics laws, but they don't specify a single one. They go, well, no, there's hundreds of thousands. They don't specify one. It's very vague. Next, computer hacking conspiracy. Well, to be guilty of this, you actually have to get into and hack into a computer, a protected computer, without being authorized to do so. They're not saying Ross did that. They're alleging that he provided a platform where other people bought and sold software that might be used to hack into a computer. Oh, and then again, it could be used to legitimately, but it could be used to hack into it, so that means he's a hacker. A blatant example of transferred intent. Strikingly missing from that and the narcotics count is nothing about possessing, selling, buying, going into agreement with other people to do that. None of that, which is required by the statutes. The next one, final one, finally, the money laundering conspiracy. Well, the thing about that is it has to involve money. And of course, they're alleging he laundered Bitcoin. Now, there's a big argument about this, but the thing is, laws use words. Words have very specific definitions, and those definitions are crucial, especially in something like this. And there's a crucial distinction about what is money. Now, the government's having a big fight with itself about that. The IRS, of course, has formally and publicly declared that Bitcoin is property. The Supreme Court has repeatedly explained that the IRS is the ultimate authority on these interpretations. The Department of Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network agrees. They say virtual currency does not have legal tender status in any jurisdiction, period. But the prosecution goes, no, we don't need a definition. Everything should be funds. And Joshua said, well, that opens the door to calling bartering, any exchangeable property, funds, and then it makes it all liable to money laundering charges, which expands criminal liability to a lot more people. Very expansive. So, in summary, we have a bunch of gaps between statutes and allegations. And one lawyer said, you know, if they have all this murder for hire on them, why do they have to contort the laws to get the guy? But anyway, that's another question. But they're trying to apply laws that are created for physical crime to a digital world. Now, they don't have the laws to address this case, as far as I can see. But you know, then you have to go to the legislature, you have to make laws, it's really inconvenient, you know, and the hassle, I mean, separation of powers, what a pain. So much easier to just take a law and slap it on there and strong arm it on there, even if it doesn't fit. So, can they do this? Can they strong arm inadequate laws onto unmatching allegations? Well, they say they can, and they defend it. They say, and this is a quote from, this isn't writing, this is a quote from their papers, federal criminal laws are expansive and adaptable especially when it comes to the internet. When I hear the government saying their laws are expansive, I get alarmed. It's alarming. And they also add in there, by the way, the arm of the law is far longer than Ulbricht imagines it to be. Very anonymous, ominous. Very ominous tone, I thought. And I think our framers would agree with that, it was ominous. They wrote 4 of the first 8 amendments of the Bill of Rights to keep that arm from overextending itself.
Woo! Yeah!
And guaranteeing rights for the criminally accused, because they were dealing with prosecutorial overreach with the British, and they wanted to make sure it didn't happen here. So the prosecution may say, oh, come on, that's so 1790, you know. But we do still have a Constitution. It still does have a 5th Amendment. That 5th Amendment does still have a due process clause, and that due process clause says, laws cannot be expansive or broadly applied. Prosecutors can't rewrite or expand statutes at whim. Okay, well, then the government says, we're not required to use technical precision or specify alleged violations. Well, again, we have the 5th Amendment with its due process clause, and that says not specifically naming essential and specific elements of a charge is prohibited. In addition, the 6th Amendment says charges must be clear and specific. It's not something that can morph and grow and change just because of the whim of some prosecutor. How do you defend yourself against that? The Circuit Court agrees. An indictment must specifically describe a particular criminal act, not just a type of crime. So general charges like, oh, kingpin, can't simply be thrown at somebody. They have to specifically say how it fits the statute. There's also something called the void for vagueness doctrine, which the Supreme Court calls the first essential of due process of law. It's a serious thing. And they